This is Gregory Mona, aka Master Moo, and with another occasional, intermittent weekly edition of Art is the Church of God, the Creator, in which we talk about the intersections of music, philosophy, psychology, science, and from a variety of perspectives, old and new, east and west, north and south. And today, we've been talking about Aristotle's Poetics, John Cage. I'll be coming back to both, so this is just a one-off detour before we get back to talking about the contemporary relevance of Aristotle's Poetics and the personal teachings I received from John Cage and how that informs my musical practice. I would like to talk about another musical inspiration for me personally today, but going all the way back. Hildegard of Bingen, Hildegard von Bingen, who died on this day, September 17th, in the year 1179, at the age of 81. She lived to the ripe old age of 81 in the deep, dark ages, in the high medieval. And she's an extraordinarily important figure, and she has now been elevated to the status of a saint. And in parts, in certain churches, in the Catholic Church and in the Anglican and Lutheran churches, she is venerated as a saint, has been for about the past 12 years. And I didn't know about her as a kid, but she was canonized in 2012 by former Pope Benedict. And she was canonized 13 years ago, even though she lived 800 years ago. So I'd like to give you a little bit of background, and I want to focus on her musical poetic achievement. So today's subtitle for today's talk is the Musico-poetic legacy of Hildegard of Bingen, and what she means for me and what she might mean for you. So what I suggest is that if you hear this and you're not already familiar, if you haven't already encountered the music of Hildegard of Bingen, I suggest this is a sort of a teaser trailer booster for you to go out and listen, go on YouTube and listen to as much Hildegard of Bingen. Go on and Bingen binge. Go binging on Bingen. Pardon the pun. Okay. And so I'll summarize some official biographical information and sort of speed to her musical work, which is what's most important to me. And okay, so Hildegard of Bingen is her approximate dates are circa 1098. She definitely died 17th of September 1179, so we believe at the age of 81. Sometimes known as the Sibyl of the Rhine, was a German Benedictine abbess and polymath, active as a writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, visionary, and as a medical writer and practitioner during the High Middle Ages. So not during the Dark Ages, but during the High Middle Ages. And she is one of the best-known composers of sacred monophony, as well as one of the most recorded in modern history. And she is considered by a number of scholars to be a founder of scientific natural history in Germany. So she's not only an important figure in religious history, obviously, but in musical history and in scientific history. And so truly a Renaissance person before the Renaissance, a great polymath. And for that reason, she is considered to be, in the Catholic Church, a doctor of the Church. And so actually, since I just mentioned her church thing, I'll just mention that, at one of the churches I attend is St. Thomas Episcopal. In the Anglican Church, there is a little invocation for Hildegard of Bingen. And it's just one sentence long. Please forgive me if I read it. And I apologize if this is too sanctimonious or pompous, but as is my wont. Okay, so the invocation of Hildegard of Bingen is: God of all times and seasons, give us grace that we, after the example of your servant Hildegard, may both know and make known the joy and jubilation of being part of your creation, and show forth your glory in the world, through Jesus Christ our Savior, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Okay? And you can take that or leave it. But that was today is the Mass day or a feast day for Hildegard of Bingen, because it commemorates her death. And she was elected as a Mother Superior in 1136. She founded monasteries throughout the Rhineland. She wrote theological, botanical, medicinal works, letters, hymns, antiphons for the liturgy. She wrote poems, supervised miniature illuminations of her first work, Scivias. And there are more surviving chants by Hildegard than any other composer from the entire Middle Ages. She is one of the few known composers to have written both the music and the words. And this is what I want to focus on, her fusion of music and words. This is what's so important for me. Her musico-poetic legacy is today's topic. One of her works, Ordo Virtutum, is an early example of a liturgical drama and arguably the oldest surviving morality play. And that's what I want to focus on, her Ordo Virtutum, which in my opinion is more than that. In my opinion, it's really the first opera. So I'll come back to Ordo Virtutum in just a minute. I just want to give the overview of her life and work, and put her sort of in context and sort of establish her relevance. She is noted for the invention of a constructed language known as lingua ignota. You're probably familiar with like Da Vinci Code and these things. Many of the great geniuses of the late Middle Ages and of the Renaissance used ciphers and constructed languages, some of which have not been translated. And the history of her formal canonization is complicated, and regional Catholic churches have listed her as a saint for centuries. And this was formalized in 2012. On May 10th, 2012, Pope Benedict XVI extended the liturgical cult of Hildegard to the entire Catholic Church in a process known as equivalent canonization. So she was not canonized by the whole procedure of the cardinal churches and all that, but through the intervention of the Pope, because she had already been de facto viewed as a saint. On 7th of October 2012, he named her a Doctor of the Church in recognition of, quote, her holiness of life and the originality of her teaching. The doctors of the Church in the Catholic Church are the greatest thinkers, the greatest intellectuals, like Thomas Aquinas and so on and so forth. These are the, it's the very, very elite. I think there are only 39 doctors of the Church, and she's one of them. So kudos to Benedict for doing that. That was one of his last official acts, because very soon after, a few months after that, in 2013, he resigned from the papacy, and he just died a couple years ago. He was retired for quite some time. So from a very young age, she states in her biography, in her memoirs, that she experienced visions, and neurologists say that she experienced migraines, what she describes as, and I can simply quote from her one of her letters, which she wrote at the age of 77. She said, "From my early childhood, before my bones, nerves, and veins are fully strengthened, I have always seen this vision in my soul, even to the present time when I am more than 70 years old. In this vision, my soul, as God would have it, rises up high into the vault of heaven and into the changing sky, and spreads itself out among different peoples, although they are far away from me in distant lands and places. And because I see them this way in my soul, I observe them in accord with the shifting clouds of other created things. I do not hear them with my outward ears, nor do I perceive them by the thoughts of my own heart or any combination of my five senses, but in my soul alone, while my outward eyes are open. So I have never fallen prey to ecstasy in the visions, but I see them wide awake day and night. I am constantly fettered by sickness, and often in the grip of pain, so intense that it threatens to kill me, but God has sustained me until now. The light which I thus see is not spatial, but it is far, far brighter than a cloud which carries the sun. I can measure neither height nor length nor breadth in it, and I call it, quote, the reflection of the living light, unquote. And as the sun, the moon, and the stars appear in water, so writing, sermons, virtues, and certain human actions take form for me and gleam. And she was quite an important political figure in the Benedictine monasteries of her time, and she was very involved with, with the managing of monasteries and in touch with other people, despite her, obviously the restrictions on her as a woman, I mean, within a patriarchal society, but also her suffering of, obviously, what was these migraines or neurological conditions. And Hildegard said that she first saw this shade of the living light from the age of 3, and that by the age of 5 she began to understand that she was experiencing visions. She used the term visio, Latin for vision, to describe this feature of her experience, and she recognized that it was a gift that she could not explain to others. And Hildegard explained that she saw all things through the light of God through the five senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. This is actually very significant to me, because this is my feeling about when I say the name of this blog is Art is the Church of God the Creator. And what do I mean by God the Creator? I mean that divinity as revealed to us through our five senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. And from my perspective, and you can take it or leave it, each of our five senses is sacred, is sacralized, and ultimately non-dual. And we have dualistic experiences of subject and object because this is the way our minds are set up in terms of sort of subject-object dualism. But the purpose of art, when I say art is the church, is to restore the actual non-dual nature of sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. So, in the case of musical art, we are trying to reestablish the actual true nature of hearing, which is that in the actual true nature of hearing, there is neither subject nor object. In other words, when we are truly encountering sound, we are not actually the actual experience, the actual phenomenology of hearing is that there is a non-dual relationship between the sound that we are receiving from what we imagine is sort of outside, and then the inside experience of sound. So the source of sound, or the creator of sound, the agent of sound, and then the receiver of sound, that's an arbitrary distinction. There is just hearing. There is simply sound without subject or object. When we are listening to music, we have complete focus. The great musician, the great composer, creates a structure of sound which requires absolute 100% attention, non-dual attention. So a great composer like Beethoven or Bach creates a structure of sound so compelling that you must stay completely with it in every millisecond of its unfolding. That is so enjoyable and so captivating and so fascinating that you must stay with it and not space out, and not think about anything else, and not think about the instrument that it's coming from, or some other thought that it makes you think about. And all you can do is just stay there in the present moment with the sound. That is the essence of hearing. So that is what I mean when I say that music is a revelation of God in sound. And the specific aspect of God, which is revealed through the senses, is God the Creator. And what is true of sound in music, which is the primary focus of these podcasts here, is also true of all five senses, just as Hildegard said. So in the case of sight, we can say that visual art is the revelation of God through sight, through and in other words, when we are completely in the presence of a great artwork, that we have a non-dual experience of seeing. We just focus totally on the painting or the film or whatever the visual experience is, and there is no question of a visual subject, a visual object. And we have a non-dual experience of sight. That is the essence of the visual artwork. And this is also true for the less obvious senses, for taste, smell, and touch. The truly great chef creates a non-dual experience of taste. The truly great parfumier, or creator of incense, creates a non-dual experience of fragrance, of olfactory sensation. The truly great couturier, for example, in terms of texture, creates a non-dual experience of touch. So even though, we might customarily relegate those to applied arts rather than fine arts, I really think that on the highest level, taste, smell, touch reach the same artistic height as sight and hearing. I think the main difference is whether or not it triggers biological functions. In other words, you can listen to music and you can appreciate visual art for quite a long time before you start having involuntary functional response to metabolism, like mouth watering or feeling hungry, or saying that. So it is true that taste, smell, and to a lesser extent touch, trigger those sort of autonomic nervous responses. Nevertheless, I think they all are connect to the level of high art. Getting back to Hildegard. Hildegard was hesitant to share her visions, confiding only to her confessor and her tutor, and later her secretary. And throughout her life, she continued to have many visions. And then at the age of 42, supposedly in the year 1141, she received a vision from God, to quote, commanding to write down that which you see and hear. She was still hesitant to record her visions, and she became physically ill. And those were, her book, Civius, were the record of her visions that she experienced. And so that became the basis of her first theological text. She describes her struggle, her inner struggle here. She says, "Though I saw and heard these things, I refused to write for a long time through doubt and bad opinion, through the diversity of human words, not with stubbornness, but in the exercise of humility. Until laid low by the scourge of God, I fell upon a sickness, then compelled at last by many illnesses, and by the witness of a certain noble maiden of good contact, said that the man of whom I secretly sought and found, as mentioned, I set my hand to writing. And while I was doing it, I sensed, as I mentioned before, the deep profundity of scriptural exposition. And, raising myself from illness by the strength I received, I brought this work to a close, though just barely, in 10 years. And I spoke these things not by invention, but by heart of any other person, but as the secret mysteries of God, and received them from heavenly places. And again I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, Cry out, therefore, and write thus." And so she worked on her first book from the age of 42 to her early 50s, about the age of 52. It was between November 1147 and February of 1148 that writings and her visions became known, and she received papal approval to document her visions as revelations from the Holy Spirit, giving her credence. So she was not branded as a witch or as a heretic or anything like that. And her work continued with the approval of the church, which is great, because visionary women have not always had that, as you know, right? And okay, so then she wrote other works in the Order of Virtutum, which we'll come back to in just a minute, and her correspondences with all the various like nobles in her region and stuff like that, emperors, abbots, abbesses, her material on natural medicines, her invented language, all of that. Her manuscripts. What I wanted to say about before we get to her visionary theology and her music is that her natural history, in one sense, is from the High Middle Ages, is Aristotelian. Is coming from the natural history of Aristotle, and then as was transmitted by the church fathers like Thomas Aquinas and stuff like that. But her philosophical position, which informs her sort of her theology and her music, was Neoplatonist, and ultimately derived from a Pythagorean standpoint. So she brings together sort of the two major streams, Pythagoreanism, Neo-Pythagoreanism via Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy in her theology, and sort of Aristotelian observation empiricism in her vision, in her natural history, because she was also quite the herbalist. A lot of it had to do with self-medication and trying to find medical solutions to her pain, which she experienced throughout her whole life, her migraines, which I also suffer from, but perhaps not to the extent that she did. And let's skip ahead to her music. And before we get into her music, a couple of words about her theology. She discussed her visionary theology in that first book that we discussed, Civios, and her later books. My Latin is a little bit rusty. The Liber Vitae Meritorum, the Life of Books Merits, and the Liber Divinorum Operum, the Book of Divine Works, and also known as De Operatione, Dei on God's Activity, completed around 1172 or 1174. And these volumes, she continued writing them well into her 70s. She began writing in her 40s, and her books came out, so you can say that she was a late bloomer, right? She describes each vision. The details are often strange and enigmatic, and then interprets the theological contents in the words of, quote, the voice of the living light. And so we can skip over that, but you can find manuscript reproductions of all these online, and you can dig into it. It's extremely fascinating. All right, but what I want to focus on is her music, and which is how I've come to know her. And then specifically at the Ordo Virtutum. In addition to her opera, her musical morality play, Ordo Virtutum, she composed many liturgical songs that were collected into a cycle called Symphonia Harmoniae Celestium Revelationem. Songs from the Symphonia are set to her own text, range from antiphons, hymns, and sequences and responsories. Her music is monophonic, consisting of exactly one melodic line. And his style is characterized by soaring melodies that push the boundaries of traditional Gregorian chant and to stand outside the normal practices of monophonic monastic chant. When you listen to her music, you're struck by the extraordinary range. And when you try to sing it, it really makes tremendous demands on your voice. I mean, of course, I can't sing it at pitch because they're written for women's voices, but even singing along an octave lower, she goes up to high C. I mean, it pushes, it confounds the idea that the extended head voice was only discovered later. I mean, it shows that the high voice parts that we find in certain Renaissance and Baroque compositions existed well below, before in the medieval period. In fact, and her use of melisma. What I find, let's see what some scholars have to say. It is her music is highly melismatic with often recurrent melodic units, and Scholars note the intimate relationship between music and text in Hildegard's composition, whose rhetorical features are more distinct than in its common 12th century chant. This is really important. This is why I'm calling this talk the musico-poetic legacy of Hildegard of Bingen, because she really set text to music and always thinks in terms of a climactic high point. She has large arcs of poetic phrases, and she matches the melodic climax to the poetic climax in a way which is very compelling if you're aware of the words. It's okay. As with most medieval chant notation, Hildegard's music lacks any indication of tempo or rhythm. The surviving manuscripts employ the late German style notation, which includes very ornamental neumes, which are the type of notes that were used in the 12th century. And we're not going to be talking about her scientific and medicinal writings, except to emphasize that she was and we're not going to talk about her invented language, except to say that this is just part of her overall genius, and the fact that she was not bound by modern concepts of specialization. She is a polymath, and nowadays we tend to call polymaths charlatans, and I am, if I speak out of in ignorance on subjects that I'm not qualified to speak of, then I guess I am guilty as charged as in charlatanism. But I said, but if in fact I am a self-proclaimed charlatan, I am certainly not of the exploitative variety, because I'm just giving this away for free. I mean, there's no I'm not doing this for money, that's for sure. All right, I could be doing other stuff for money right now. I want to focus on what I consider to be her magnum opus, her greatest work, her masterpiece, the Ordo Virtutum, an allegorical morality play, a sacred music drama composed around 1151. And again, this is monophonic, and this is about 40 to 50 years before the explosion of polyphony in the Notre Dame school of Periton and Leonin, and we can talk about that some other time. This is late medieval monophony, but carried to an extremely high order of artistic perfection. And I think it's the greatest example of monophonic, of single melody writing. And the idea of monophony continues today. It is the dominant form, really, of most hip-hop and pop music. I mean, there's been a progressive sort of focus on monophony in pop music. I mean, there's less functional harmony, certainly less 1-5-1 tonality. There's certainly less semitone oriented, like, leading tone resolutions. We hardly ever hear perfect authentic cadences. We hardly ever hear a 7 resolved to the 1 and 4 resolved to the 3 and 1-5-1. I mean, that's almost completely, we mostly hear modal alternations of 1 and flat 7, right? We mostly hear that kind of like 7 limit monophony is sort of like the dominant musical language of contemporary hip hop and pop music, and that's fine. It's whatever speaks to people. And the language of polyphony, which exploded out of the Notre Dame in Paris around the year 1200, is we're far away from that. And she was also geographically separated. She was in the Rhineland, and so she was also about 50 years before that. So let's come back to this. This is the earliest morality play by more than a century, and the only medieval musical drama to survive with an attribution for both text and music. So, long before Wagner or anyone, she was the first she was the first auteur to create both text and music and drama all together. And it is my thesis that Hildegard of Bingen is the first great Western composer. For me, she before some people say that Western music begins with Guillaume de Machaut, or the Ars Nova. Some people say it begins with the Ars Antiqua with Leonin and Periton, also great composers. But even before that, almost 100 years before that, we have Hildegard of Bingen writing a perfectly unified artistic masterpiece in the Ordo Virtutum, which has never been performed at a major opera house, at least not here in the United States, not at the Metropolitan Opera, not at the New York City Opera, not at any opera house I've ever been aware of. And to me, that is astonishing and horrible. Just as another perfect work of art, the Orfeo of Monteverdi, or the Orpheus legend of Monteverdi, has also, as far as I know, never been performed at the Metropolitan Opera. Shame on them. But anyway, let's get back to Ordo Virtutum. I'm hoping that someone is listening to this who is in a position to commission a performance that will get done at a major house, at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, at the Metropolitan, anywhere, City Center, Chicago, Los Angeles, but please, New York, please, New York, London, Paris, Munich. All right. Everyone talk about Hildegard of Bingen. A short version of it without music appeared at the end of her first book. So she worked on this intermittently from her 40s, but then she continued to develop it over a period of time. And although, she lived for another 40 years after writing it. So, this is not even her final work. The plot, the subject of the opera, and I call it an opera, is typical for a morality play. And it recounts neither biblical events nor a saint's life nor miracles. It is about the struggle for a human soul, or anima, between the virtues and the devil. So there's three main characters. The piece can be divided as follows. Part one, a prologue in which the virtues are introduced to the patriarchs and the prophets who marvel at the virtues. Part two, we hear the complaints of souls that are imprisoned in bodies. For now, the happy soul enters, and her voice contrasts with the unhappy souls. The soul is too eager to skip life and go straight to heaven. When the virtues tell her that she has to live first, the devil seduces her away to worldly things. Again, this is philosophy. This is Neoplatonist philosophy, which is very dualistic in terms of the mind-body split, the soul and the body and all of that. But, we can also understand that through the tremendous difficulty that Hildegard had living in a female-identified body in a very sexist patriarchal time, and living in a differently abled body, suffering from migraines and physical, and triumphing over all of that. So what we may interpret as a dualistic denigration of the body may also be understood as a realistic depiction of the struggles that she herself had with her own body. Just as I have struggles with my own body, and you may have struggles with your own body, doesn't necessarily mean that you hate being embodied, but you understand that there's a struggle involved. Yeah. Okay. Part three. The virtues take turns identifying and describing themselves, while the devil occasionally interrupts and expresses opposing views and insults. This is the longest section by far, and although devoid of drama or plot, the musical elements of this section make it stand out. This is my favorite part of Ordo Virtutum. Part 4. The soul returns repentant. Once the virtues have accepted her back, they turn on the devil whom they bind. Together they conquer the devil, and then God is praised. And Part 5 is a procession of all the characters. So Part 5 is just ceremonial, but quite triumphant. And in terms of the roles, there's a soul for a female voice, a soprano voice that goes quite high. The virtues are sung by 17 solo female voices, and the humility, hope, chastity, innocence, contempt of the world, celestial love, discipline, modesty, mercy, victory, discretion, patience, knowledge of God, charity, fear of God, obedience, and faith. So there are 17 named virtues, and these virtues were seen as role models for the women of the abbey who took joy in overcoming their weaknesses and defeating the devil in their own lives. Chorus of the prophets and patriarchs sung by a male chorus, and the chorus of souls is sung by a women's chorus, and the devil is a male voice, but the devil does not sing. He only yells or grunts. According to Hildegard, he cannot produce a divine harmony. So the male voices are the male chorus of the prophets and patriarchs, and the only other solo male voice we hear is not speaking. This is not singing. It's just a Sprechstimme. And this, to me, is a striking parallel to the other great sort of morality play of the 20th century, Moses and Aaron of Arnold Schoenberg. I don't think there's going to be an opera house in the world that would dare put them on the same program, but to me they are bookends of biblical sort of theological revelation in music. I consider Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron to be one of the greatest revelations of God in music ever. It sends chills up and down my spine. I love it, even though it's unfinished. I love what exists of it, and so hopefully some other time we'll get to talk about the theological dimensions of Schoenberg's 12-tone technique, because I believe, and I'm quite certain, that the collection of the 12 chromatic tones of the octaves for Schoenberg is a picture of divinity, despite the fact that we experience it as extreme dissonance. Like, that's the ultimate dissonance, would be the 12 tones sounding together, right? And on the piano, cluster. And but in Schoenberg's 12-tone technique is devoted to opening that up for us to hear actually the harmony underlying the apparent noise and chaos. But anyway, let's get back to Hildegard. Okay. What else is interesting about this casting? Well, the personification of the virtues by female voices. Now you say, well, what's surprising about that? In other words, in sort of like from a presentist perspective, we typically personify the virtues and as woman or female identified. But that was absolutely not the case in classical times. In fact, it was the opposite. The word virtue, which is the from Latin virtus, right, is originally derived from the Greek arete, which means excellence. Now, in classical Greek, arete, and I think the voice goes up at the end because I believe that's the stressed syllable, and it's please, if you're a classicist, please comment here in the comments thread if I'm not giving the correct intonation. But as you know, classical Greek was a tonal language, which means that the pitch of the voice goes up on the stressed syllable arete, and is gender neutral. Is a neuter gender in Greek, which means that it can be applied to men, women, or things. So it applies to the manly excellence, when it's gendered as male, in terms of like the virtues of the ideal warrior or athlete, right? But it's also, arete is also used to describe women and the excellence of women. For example, Homer talks about Penelope, her steadfastness, her bravery, her courage, in waiting for the return of Ulysses, and fending off temptations, her discipline, all of that as in terms of her arete, in terms of her excellence, and also for inanimate objects, the arete of a great sword, the excellence of a great sword, the arete, the excellence of a great work of art, and so on and so forth. However, in the Latin language, when the concept of arete transferred over from Greek civilization to Roman civilization, during that period, that syncretic period when Well, of course, I mean, from the very beginning, from like the 6th century BC, of course, the Romans were aware of and were influenced by the Greeks. But I mean, absolutely from like the accession of the Greek empire into the Roman world in like 3rd century BC, when it became part of the Roman Republic, then under the Roman language, the term arete became mapped onto a gendered word in the Latin language, virtus, and the root word vir, is synonymous with specifically gendered male gender. And so in the Latin, in the world of the Latin-speaking people, virtus is by definition restricted only to men. So it's that's an extremely patriarchal and sexist concept of virtue. It was the ultimate considered manliness, and that was part and parcel of the sort of Roman military society. I mean, it's a legitimate question. I mean, the Greeks were just as militaristic and just as patriarchal as the Romans. I mean, why the Romans restricted it to the masculine identity that's a question for classicists. I'm not a classicist. And so I really think the personification of the soul, anima is feminine, animus is masculine, anima, so anima there's always been the understanding of but I think the personification of the virtues, female voices, is really a transvaluation of values, which is really quite something. And I think that is ultimately a byproduct, and a good byproduct, of the Catholic veneration of Mary, the idea of the Mother of God, God the Mother of God, the Theotokos. I mean, the idea of Mary not merely as sort of the human, womb of bearing the living God of Christ, but is actually as a divine being herself, as a unique intercessor between humanity and especially in the moments of birth and death, right? So I think that idea of the embodiment of the virtues in female form, I think, has a lot to do with the rise of the Marian cult, and which is very much here in the, which unfortunately has been in retreat ever since the Reformation, ever since the 1500s, and even more so extremely ever since the Enlightenment, and of course, now in our present sort of totally, officially desacralized world, in which, the only people who feel empowered to talk on theology are morons, semi-educated people who've like actually never read classics and have never bothered to think, so people like you and me who are actually educated and who are actually well read and are actually thoughtful are bullied into shutting up, and we're not supposed to talk about theology. We're supposed to just like give that to the yahoos, and like give them that, and that's, pardon me, that's bullshit. All right? Everyone has a right to express their relationship to their spiritual life. That is not the sole province of any class or race or any sort of bullshit identity subdivision. That is a universal human right for all human beings. I am exercising my universal human right to talk about theological concepts, and you should do the same. You are thus empowered to do the same. I hope that's the whole point of this podcast, is to get over that sort of allergy and shame that we all developed as college-educated people around the G word, fear that we would become like crazy religious fanatics, or that we would be handing out pamphlets on the streets, or just, being embarrassing lunatics at the next family meal. Anyway, I've got other things to be embarrassed about at family meals, not about this. So, this is my praise of Ordo Virtutum, and there's another personal dimension is that the lead character of the anima, the soul, was written for her closest friend, her female friend, Richardis von Stade, Hildegard's fellow nun and friend, who had left to become the abbess of another convent. Hildegard was upset by this appointment and tried to have it revoked. She even appealed directly to the Pope. At that time, Pope Eugene III, I don't know anything about him. Hildegard was unsuccessful, and Richardis departed and then died shortly thereafter on October 29th, 1151. And so there is a personal dimension here, that it's also a work of mourning for her departed friend, and she was trying to communicate with the soul of her friend in the character of the soul. I think that's very beautiful, very emotional. I think that should be kept in mind for any director of this opera, is that it's quite personal and it's not conventional at all. Other people find connections to the male characters to Hildegard's brother Bruno. Yeah. And before dying, Richardis told her brother Bruno that she wanted to return to Hildegard, not unlike the returning repentant soul of Ordo Virtutum. Yeah. And so there's a little bit of personal heartbreak and tragedy in the background of the composition, which I think is in the music, and which I think can be brought out by an intelligent director. Yeah. And now, the composition itself is almost impossible to decipher in the original manuscript unless you're a highly trained scholar. Hildegard of Bingen received no traditional education in composition, nor was she trained to play instruments. She was entirely self-taught, although not in a way that people would expect. Her whole life, she was clairvoyant and clairaudient. She had visual visions, and she also had sonic, she heard things. And the music came to her in vision. She attempted to describe what she was going through in works in Ordo Virtutum. So she had secretaries that she recounted her visions and her music to. So the resulting manuscript was a collaborative effort. Music was part of her daily life in the abbey, and the nuns chanted psalms several times a day during the Liturgy of the Hours. And the performance of non-liturgical music was more rare, having to do with celebrations and the special occasions in the life of the community. Hildegard, in connection to her natural history and unified with that, and this is what I find so fascinating, is that all of these things which today we consider to be separate specialties were unified in her mind. And I think this had to do with the vision of the Pythagorean, Neo-Pythagorean, Platonic, Neoplatonist vision of the one. There's a fundamental oneness of her different outpourings, which we see, just as we see in the diverse works of Plato and Aristotle and stuff. So even though her natural history was said was sort of like neo-Aristotelian, she said Hildegard of Bingen believed that music had a powerful, even medical effect on people. And that vision of music is Platonic. In Plato's Republic, he talks about the psychological and spiritual effects of the various modes, of the Lydian versus the Dorian, and so on and so forth. Those are not the church modes, those are the ancient Greek modes, right? Music was a type of biblical meditation. The manner in which this was practiced resembles in some manner the way of Buddhist meditation. Other religions use music. Buddhist chant, which I practice myself. And the neurologist Oliver Sacks has researched Hildegard's belief that music can bring a connection between the human brain's two hemispheres to heal and calm the body. Oliver Sacks, who just recently departed, very great, important neurologist. Read his book Musico-poetic, about sort of the dimensions of music and music healing, the effectiveness of music for migraine patients. Also his book on migraines talks about Hildegard of Bingen and talks about the sort of the deep psychological and spiritual dimensions of music in Musico-poetic. He was a music lover and a migraine sufferer. And from a scientific perspective, please read the neurological writings of Oliver Sacks. Okay, in terms of the musical elements, Ordo Virtutum is written in dramatic verse, contains 82 different melodies, which are set more syllabically than Hildegard's liturgical songs. The liturgical songs are melismatic, and these more syllabic setting allows us to hear the words more clearly. Yeah, and it's not entirely syllabic, but it's syllabic enough that we can really make out the words. We don't have like medieval melismas going on for like minutes on like a single like vowel or something like that. All parts are sung in plain chant except that of the devil. The devil is just spoken, as I said. Oh, the spoken character in Moses and Aaron is Moses, and that's extraordinary. I mean, I'm not making any sort of connection between the two characters, but the central character of Moses and Aaron does not sing. That of Arnold Schoenberg. Everyone around him sings. Aaron sings, and the Hebrews and everyone, they all sing. Moses is tongue-tied and cannot express the inexpressible, and therefore his teachings get perverted. That's the tragedy of represented in Schoenberg's opera Moses and Aaron. Great work, which perhaps we'll have a chance to discuss some other time. There is an alternation between solo and chorus parts, as well as melismatic versus syllabic lines. So there's a variety of music, despite the fact that there's no harmony in the modern sense at all. I think, all right, the main acts in the play are set in allegorical in towers, and musical dimensions are driven by architectural understanding. For example, the development of processional chants that link the action in one tower to that of the other. So that's the setting. So visually you would have to build those sort of towers on stage and move the action. It would ideally be done in the round, I think. The final verses of the play move into a mystical mode and describe the crucifixion of Christ, asking the audience to bend their knees so that God may stretch out his hand to you. All right, so there are stage directions in the text itself in Latin. Genua Vestra, I was using scholastic Latin, not church Latin. Genua vestra ad patram vestrum flectite ad vobis manum. All right, I keep on switching back into scholastic Latin. All right, but church et vi ut vobis manum suum porigat. At the final word, porigat, stretch out, is set up to 39 notes, is the longest melisma in the play. It is meant to illustrate the stretch of the divine hand towards humanity. So again, this is where the director would have to ask the audience members to physically do that. It would have to be a participatory theater. And that's a stretch. That's really asking people to go out of their comfort zone in terms of like enacting a religious drama, but that's the way it should be performed. Yeah. And extremely fascinating work, and I hope that I will be alive and well enough to see a fully staged production in my lifetime. I love the music. It's great music. Go listen to it. And it has drama, it has emotion, and it is a perfectly unified, perfectly wrought work of art from the 12th century, from the year 1152. Before the rise of the Notre Dame polyphony, before the rise of the Ars Nova, before the rise of the Ars Antigua, the Ars Nova, before the rise of Renaissance triadicism, before the rise of Baroque common practice music, before the rise of modern chromaticism. It's extraordinary. And this is why I consider Hildegard of Bingen to be the first great Western composer, and this is why I feel that the Hildegard of Bingen's musico-poetic legacy lives on today and should be honored on today, September 17th, 2025, which is the feast day, the day she died in 1198, and her feast day in Christian churches throughout the world. So that's it for this episode of Art is the Church of God the Creator. With me, with Gregory Muna, aka Master Moo. And anyway, see you soon. Be well. Keep joining your enjoyment of music with your real spiritual life. And hopefully that'll get us through to something more positive. I need it. I think other people need it as well. That's my hope.